Hello, welcome back to my channel. I wanted to just do a quick video today on complex PTSD. And so I'm trying to make this channel, it is narcissistic abuse, but there are accompanying things that come with that. And it all connects. So complex PTSD as opposed to regular PTSD, they're both equally, isn't like one is worse than the other. They're just different, and they can also overlap. So what most people think of as PTSD, post traumatic stress disorder, is more of a one incident type of trauma. So in other words, a car accident, maybe some kind of assault. Perhaps it could be something that happened, soldier in battle, or a violent incident at some point in the life. But it's more isolated. Of course, it's equally, it's also damaging, but it's a more one-off or more isolated type incident that happens. Complex PTSD is basically comes from childhood. So it's a history of trauma. And the complex really just gives it that it's basically layers on layers and layers of trauma. So generally it'll start from an earlier age. A lot of times it can start at birth, with a type of insecure attachment. I think I've gone over attachment before. But basically it could be that you had an abusive parent from the get-go, and you ended up with some kind of insecure attachment. It could be that perhaps it was another caregiver. It could have started a bit later as a child, but generally it starts in childhood and it continues on through adulthood. So that's more the idea of complex PTSD. A lot of the symptoms do overlap. Particular things like flashbacks, rumination, which is just very intense thinking where you get in your head and you keep going over the same thing over and over again. A lot of anxiety. You can have a startled response. You can go into what we call hypervigilance, which is anxiety, being very on the alert, always looking around, looking over your shoulder, feeling very unsafe, or hypo, where that's more depression, slower, can't get out of bed, what's the point of it all, cocooning, isolating yourself, withdrawing. You can do both, you can fluctuate. So there are some similar symptoms, some overlap, but the difference is that the complex one, basically you have trauma built on trauma, built on trauma. And how that ties into narcissistic abuse is that if you had a narcissistic parent, and again, you can have an abusive parent who isn't necessarily narcissistic. There are other types of parental abuse that can take place. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a narcissistic parent, but if you had any type of childhood abuse, you are more vulnerable now to get into abusive relationships later on in life. It can also go the other way, and you could also become abusive if you don't, if that isn't attended to. It's identifying with your abuser and then becoming the abuser in the relationships. But I'm going to, because this is a channel about mostly about narcissistic abuse, I'm going to focus more on getting into abusive relationships, so being more of the victim or the person that is abused. So I hope this makes sense. If you would like, I can do a more in-depth study or a more in-depth video about complex trauma or complex PTSD, C-PTSD versus, I guess, regular or one incident PTSD. But this is kind of just gives you the overview, and that if you do have complex PTSD, you are more likely to get into abusive relationships. You are more likely to be vulnerable to a narcissist. And unfortunately, the narcissist will pick up on that and they can exploit that. So that is unfortunately what can happen. Now, the good news is that once you realize that you do have complex PTSD and start to do the work and start to heal, you will no longer be vulnerable to narcissistic abuse. You'll no longer be vulnerable to getting involved in narcissists. So I'm talking about more when you either don't realize that that's what's going on or hasn't been addressed, or you're just full of all the self-blame, and haven't been able to reflect about it and have really internalized your abuse. So that's what gets us into these sticky situations where we're basically repeating the past over and over again. This can also be repeated in with friends, with colleagues, with bosses, with really any type of relationship or any way that we relate to people out in the world. So that's in a nutshell. That's a short look at complex PTSD. And if you like this video, please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe if you haven't already done so. And I will see you in the next one. Okay, bye for now.